Now it's interesting out there, a lot of these, we're going to talk about 10 worst deer habitat improvements, and what's interesting, a lot of this applies to wildlife in general. And a lot of this applies, what I'm talking about primarily is small parcels, and I'm talking 500 to 800 acres and less. And man, if you have 5-10 acres that you're trying to manage, you can't afford to make mistakes of creating and spending time, money, resources to create poor habitat improvements. And I see it all the time. I feel bad for people. I feel sorry for people. And you can imagine by the time I get to their land, they've had poor results. They know there's something better out there and they want to work at it and do what's right. And so number one, girdling is a tough one. Girdling is something that can be used in large acreage, large managed areas of public land, commercial forestry, and it's the act of going in and girdling a tree so that it dies. I've seen that on small properties to the point where it's even a danger, where trees are falling 1 to 3 years down the road. But what I see consistently is deer completely avoid the areas. A lot of times folks are girdling the wrong trees, for example, poplar, aspen, box elder, trees that actually offer a really high regenerative value and browse and cover for deer and other wildlife and creatures. And so by taking those out, then they're girdling the wrong trees, basically. But girdling trees, you can't rely on when they're gonna fall down. And it's just like, think about it, when you're logging, you should never leave a hanger. You should never leave a tree that's hung up by other trees. A good logger would never leave that there to potentially drop on a landowner's head when they're walking around the property. One almost fell on my client's head when he was on his tractor on a food plot. They had girdled about 30 to 40, 14 inch to 16-inch poplar trees right next to them, and they were coming down over a period of years, not just one time. So I cleaned those up for them. But bottom line, in that case, they destroyed the regeneration value that was in those trees with the lateral root explosion that could have taken place. That would have been offering food and cover. I've seen trees that were girdled or hack and squirt where they want to take aspen out of a stand of oaks, and they create this, you know, in theory, a bunch of oaks and beautiful oaks, and they take out all the cover down below the oaks because they hack and squirt or girdle the quote undesirables, and then all the deer leave and go bet on the neighbors because now they just had an open oak forest. They're managing for acorns that are very limited food supply and a very poor result in property. Number two, grass and conifer monolands. I see this a lot with plantings where someone's putting in a CRP field of 30 acres of native grasses. The native grasses fall down during the wintertime, can't even support a rabbit during the wintertime, let alone pheasant. And so there's just no cover, no browse, no food. The same can be said for conifer, stands of conifer, where, yeah, we're going to put this stand of conifer, we're paying someone to come out and machine plant this, and we're filling this 10 acres or 20 acres under a CRP plan. Well, if you only have 80 acres on your land and you're devoting 20 acres to a conifer wasteland of no food and really no cover when it comes down to it, because no quality cover, because if it doesn't have daytime browse in it, then it's a very poor choice. So I see this on a very large scale, and people look at, well, I get cost share assistance for this program. Well, folks, a lot of times those programs are scientific programs, scientific based. They're geared more towards public lands, state land, federal land, and commercial forestry holdings, and they're not appropriate for your 80 acres or 100 or let alone 5 acres or 10 or 20. You just can't afford to make those kind of mistakes. Oak savannas, big buzzword, low value fad. It sounds really cool. We're gonna have an oak savanna. And oak savanna is primarily grasslands and in the one timber species, and tree is oak. And you know, Little House on the Prairie days back in Minnesota, you think of that, but really no cover, no browse, and limited acorns even. And it's just a very low habitat improvement that doesn't have a fit on small parcels, because too much of your land has to be devoted to something that doesn't give you really good. Now if you're not into wildlife, if you're just doing this because, you know, it sounds cool and you have land, you're not really a big hunter, that's one thing. I don't really care what anybody does with their land. But if you want to attract wildlife, if you want to slant that more towards whitetails are pretty cool because they encompass most wildlife species. If you put whitetail in the middle of a bullseye, you're going to encompass a lot of small game species and critters, because whitetails are creatures of edge and diversity. and you have to have that diversity. Oak savanna doesn't provide diversity. Grass and conifer monocultures don't. And number 4, road plantings. What I mean by that is road planting of shrubs, road plantings of pines, road plantings of hardwoods, whatever you're trying to do. Anything road and in straight lines is not natural to deer. Instead, in fact, with grouse, and a lot of this relates to all wildlife, like I said at the beginning, Minnesota grouse studies back in the 90s revealed that grouse populations could be increased 20 times over by staggering plantings of aspen, poplar, instead of road plantings. They found that road plantings, they assumed and thought that increased the amount of predation, stress, and warfare, disease among small game species. So staggering those plantings and keeping those deer or keeping those animals separated, lower stress value. Imagine you're sitting in a road conifer stand, deer are bedded down there, 200 yards down the row, a coyote crosses, stress level is going to go through the roof for those deer. Other deer moving 200 yards away, anything moving 200 yards away. When you break that visibility down, which we like to do out here with switchgrass, with cutting lines, whatever type of cutting is appropriate for your land, every one of those lines reduces the amount of stress to the overall deer herd. That's why you can fit more deer in one parcel, more wildlife in one parcel when they have more habitat and changes in habitat. Edge, going back to edge, again, whitetails, creatures of edge, encompasses a lot of different whitetails. If you have recommendations on your small parcel, your property, even if it's 500 acres or 800 acres to plant in rows, consider planting a lot fewer, planting in clusters, clumps, and really put a lot more thought into it than just throwing trees through a machine, planting them in rows. It can often be harmful to your wildlife and whitetail goals in general. Timber rotational cuttings. You know, the scientific way is to take 500 acres, cut 20 acres every 5 years, and in 50, 60 years, whatever the math works out to, you start all over again in a hardwood setting. Well, folks, then your bedding areas and your daytime food sources and browse are always changing. They're forever changing. Every 5 years, something else is taking place, and therefore where your stands should go change, where food sources go, food plots should go change, your access, everything changes. And folks, you're always playing catch up. You're not saying, this is where my bedding areas are going to be, this is where my daytime browse is, this is where the food plots are going to go, this is where deer are going to travel. And really you're hurting yourself drastically. You're making it so you're better off hunting public land. And what I mean on public land is you go to find where deer are bedding, where they're feeding, where they're traveling, and you put your stands out accordingly. In this case, you're always playing catch up, and it's a very poor practice for small parcels, whether it's 500 acres or 40 acres. It's going to hurt you in the long run. High hinge cuts, you know, it's waste of a resource. Hinge cuts are made to be created for side cover and browse, daytime browse. So if that browse is starting above deer level, then the two main focuses of hinge cuts are not being accomplished: cover and food, browse, daytime browse and food. So cut those more at medium level, and you'll find a lot of value for your whitetails and wildlife and cover in general. Imagine if those are starting at waist level. You can even get grouse and rabbits to relate to those for escape cover and sustainable cover during the winter time. So avoid those high hinge cuts at all costs. General TSI. Now I say high hinge cuts at all costs. There are times where there's a slope, there's the edge of a woods where you're trying to screen off from hillsides, things like that. There's some really site determinations with that you have to figure out on your own. But in general, if you're just making bedding areas and creating deer habitat, you want to avoid those high hinge cuts. General TSI, what I mean by that is you have a forester come to your land and you have 80 acres of hardwood, so here's the plan, here's the select cut plan. We'll make a couple wildlife openings, that kind of thing. You know, really you need to look at more detail if you want to get the best out of your land and the most, and a lot of times, several times greater potential than simply saying we're going to select cut this land or we're going to clear cut this land. You should always, in most cases, say 90% of the time, you want areas where you want to leave as mature timber for your access and to blow your scent into while on stand. That would equate to somewhere around 10% of your land, 15% at the most. And then you'd want clear-cut pockets that would represent bedding and travel for deer in secure areas on your land. That would represent 15 to 20%. And then you're going to have 70%, 60% where you would select cut and actually create that general timber stand improvement and maintenance. you don't want the same thing to happen again, going back to those monocultures. And true, you know, another thing too, when you're creating clear cuts, it always creates that opportunity, or hinge cuts, for sunlight to get into the ground. And we're doing that in hardwoods. It always gives you the opportunity to plant 50 to 100 shade tolerant conifers per acre, for example, white spruce, white pine, and get those in there and help diversify. Again, just trying to diversify and add change to your parcel and improve the entire parcel. Harvest, hack, squirt, plant, and leave. We'll get to number 10 here. You can see over here, number 1 is the best is the food plots. Number 10, the worst deer habitat improvement is a food plot. And I want to talk about those. But harvest, hack and squirt, plant, and leave. I've seen this a lot down in Illinois, over into Iowa, Missouri. And with that thought that we're going to harvest the valuable timber, and then what's not valuable, we're going to hack and squirt, let it die and fall over. And then we're going to plant trees, hardwoods in there, and 700 per acre. And we're going to allow that to grow, and it'll be a hardwood forest someday. Well, in the meantime, I've seen, you know, really bad operations like that, where it's so thick, there's so much fallen timber around, the deer can't even move through. And so it'll block off an entire 10, 15 acres for 5-7 years before that timber breaks down. We've actually had to go in with dozers on client properties and create trails and pockets and clean up that mess. And you know the bad thing about it? Those hardwoods, we're not adding that much wildlife value. It's timber value. That was not the objective of the landowner in every case we saw. It was just they were talked into by a resource quote professional, and that's the way they were schooled, so they weren't doing anything wrong, but it was for timber improvement, not wildlife. And we had a lot of expense and time to clean up that for them so it could actually be utilized by wildlife, and especially deer, and be a part of their actual plan on a smaller parcel. So really be very wary of that practice. Habitat replacement. I see this far too often where, let's say you're taking a monoculture, a red cedar down in Missouri, and you're removing all of that red cedar, tree tubing hardwoods. Again, just terrible effect. You're removing a great base form of cover. Now, it might be that you have invasives, an autumn olive stand. I've seen autumn olive, I've talked to this before, where there's 10 acres of autumn olive, a bounty of wildlife and small game species in that location. Under a state of Michigan program, remove that 10 acres, put hardwoods in there, and in all those wildlife species that were relating to that 10 acres get hit on the road on the 2 sides of the 10 acres, or go into the open hardwoods next door and don't have any cover, and they die. And to me, that's more criminal to me, where you actually, I love wildlife, and unfortunately I love wildlife more than, you know, timber production. And so when I buy a property, I don't want a big giant stand of hardwoods. I want diversity. I don't want to have to manage that and be responsible for that timber value. I want actually high-powered wildlife improvements, because I like wildlife and I like habitat. I like diversity of habitat. Hardwoods is not. And so when you're removing large monocultures and replacing it with low-value cover, hardwoods, or whatever it might be very wary of that practice. Now, I'm all for controlling your invasives if you need to, if you want to. But some people don't have the resources for that, and at the same time, always be wary of the wildlife populations that you're destroying with your actions, not just the timber and hardwood production on your land. There's a big difference between the two. Try to find some balance and always be wary of your decisions. Number 10, food plots. The worst deer habitat improvement, because if food plots are poorly located, if they're poorly planted, if they're planted in the summer and not for the fall, if you have to walk through them to get to stands, if you're consistently spooking deer off those food plots because you have a blind right on them, you can't get in and out of that stand or blind without spooking deer, then food plots are extremely bad for your land, because food plots have the most power to attract deer to your land. Doesn't matter, even water during dry portions of the time of the year, drought. During the summertime, deer will just flock to alfalfa or greens or leaves, briar tips or leaves or shrub tips. They'll flock to those types of habitat, browse offerings, and that actually provides their moisture from them. But when it comes to food plots, they have the greatest ability, and that's why they're number 1, the best habitat improvement, and number 10, why they're the worst. Because if you're spooking deer and those food plots are allowing the local deer herd to actually pattern you more than you can pattern them, if you're located in food plots and bedding areas and you're actually pushing off buck bedding, mature bucks, they don't like to bed next to a big food plot. Does do. And so they have to bed on the outside. You can put a 5-acre food plot in the middle of a 40-acre parcel, and you really run out of room very quickly for any mature bucks on that land. So food plots, if they're located poorly, used poorly, walk through and spook deer off, they can be an absolute terrible improvement for your land. They can be the worst improvement. But on the flip side, if you locate food plots appropriately, you allow those food plots to heat up. This is the first year we've shot a whole lot of deer on food plots in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Really crazy year, but we've shot 7 out of 9 of our bucks this year on food plots, and it's because we don't spook the deer off the food plots, we don't spook out the adjacent cover. We offer cool season plantings that offer large volume, that are peaking in November and December, not peaking in July and August. We're not putting the food plots out in the summertime, so we attract a giant doe herd that takes over buck bedding. We're locating the food plots off to the side, so we're not locating them in the middle of our cover. We're doing that in Wisconsin, Minnesota. It's how I teach my clients to be the #1 herd influencers in the area. And if you do the opposite, a lot of these right here, you and especially when it relates to food plots and where your access is and stands, you will be the #1 herd influencer in the area. And by the way, you're going to have a whole bunch of wildlife on your property, because doing the opposite of this means you're going to have diversity. You're going to have the correct diversity. You're going to do it within a hunting plan that allows you to get in and out of your land without spooking deer. All the strategies that I teach in my web class, how to design your whitetail parcel, with a workbook and 18 videos, 11 hours of instruction. It's everything I teach to my clients. We can only go to about 100 clients a year. We turn away over 1,000. And Dylan's going to actually clients this year, and he's already got several booked for fly-ins. He's going to our fly-in clients this year, and he'll be in other states too that we're not going to, but he goes to a lot of clients. He's been going to, Dylan, your first client in 2017?
Yep, that's right.
So crazy to think about that, actually, that this will be your...
And Brian Lenneman.
Yes, isn't that awesome? And Brian Lennon's been by property in Minnesota this year, and so yeah, and it's crazy to think this will be your 5th season designing whitetail parcels. So, and you'll probably go to quite a few this year. And but those principles we teach, you can imagine with Dylan, unfortunately, having to listen to me, but it does work. And if it didn't, I wouldn't have the numbers, engagement levels on these videos, because if no one's learning anything from these videos, then why even bother doing them? And that engagement is going to be reflected in your comments and likes and shares on these videos. So if you're looking for the best public land spots to hunt, you're going to find diversity. You're going to find a wide variety of habitat. You're going to find areas that aren't road plantings, that aren't monocultures, and you're going to find the best locations to hunt on public land, and you're going to create the best locations for wildlife and whitetails and hunting land on private land if you do these tips and follow these tips, and make sure you do the opposite of these top 10 things to do that will not hurt your wildlife, not hurt you this season. Now, as we transition into habitat season, I hope you've had a chance to check out my web class, How to Design Your Whitetail Parcel. It's on my website, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com. I have a link in the description, and I hope you can find it, check it out, and enjoy it this year.